First instance of prayer and the first covenants in the Bible. We're also going to look at how those covenants have affected other aspects and other time frames. We're going to look specifically at the poem Michael, and we're going to look at a few songs from the 1960s, and we're also going to look at the binding of Isaac. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, we need to know what poetry does. Poetry gives authority to the speaker. It acts as an invocation, and it's very prominent in prophecy. Hebrew poetics focus on parallelism and repetition, while English poetics focus on rhyme and meter. So there's a difference in the two texts. So what is rhyme? Rhyme is any pattern of rhymes in poetry. Each new sound is assigned the next letter in the alphabet. So if you had two lines that rhymed, they would be a couplet, a rhymed couplet. So they would get AA. But the next rhyme scheme would get BB and then CC. Meter is any regular pattern of rhythm based on stressed and unstressed syllables. So when you think about how you say a word, regular, pattern, rhythm, what are the stressed and what are the unstressed syllables in that word? That's the meter. That's what makes the rhythm and the rhyme work in a poem. And that's what English poetics are based on. While Jewish or Hebrew poetics are based on repetition, and that's a literary device that repeats the same words or phrases a few times to make an idea clearer. It's also based in parallelism, or the use of components in a sentence that are grammatically the same or similar in their construction, sound, or meaning, or meter. So we're going to take a look at some of these. But first I want to look at the first poem that appears in the Bible, also the first instance of prayer. These are contained in the same passage in the Bible. So I'm going to read this to you. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived, and bore Enoch. And he builded a city, and called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. And unto Enoch was born Irad, and Irad begot Mahjil, and Mahjil begot Methuselah, and Methuselah begot Lamech. And Lamech took unto him two wives. The name of the one was Ada, and the name of the other was Zillah. And Ada bore Jabal. He was the father of such as dwell in the tents and have cattle. And his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of such that handle the harp and pipe. And Zillah, she also bore Tubal-Cain, the forger of everything cutting instrument of brass and iron. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. And Lamech said unto his wives, and this is the first instance of poetry right here. And Lamech said unto his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. Ye wives of Lamech, hearken unto my speech. For I have slain a man for wounding me, and a young man for bruising me. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold. You see the instances of repetition and parallelism in the poem. We know it's a poem because it is different than the prose in the Bible. It is set up like a poem. It reads like a poem, and it is different in the way that it is laid out. When the Bible was first written, there were no definitions between the different verses of the Bible. They weren't numbered. It was just text, and then you would get to a poem or a song, and you would know this by the way that they were laid out in the Bible. This picture here is a medieval drawing of Lamech and his two wives. And as we go on, we get to the covenant, or to the prayer. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son, and called his name Seth. For God hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel. For Cain slew him, and to Seth, to him also there was born a son, and he called his name Enosh. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. Okay, so after Seth was born and his son Enosh was born, they began to pray. This calling on the name of the Lord is the invocation or prayer. So this is the very first instance of prayer in the Bible. So it's interesting to see that before Seth, there was no prayer. And then we see this covenant kind of be formed when Cain slew Abel. It's a very interesting verse and the first instance of poetry we see. Now, I wanted you to see the genealogy of Adam to Noah, and this is where we're talking about this first little bit on the left. Seth and Enosh and Kenan and Mahale and Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, and Lamech. Well, from that group comes Noah. And from Noah we get Shem and all of his sons, or Noah and all of his sons, which leads us to Abraham. And then, of course, this table, being that it's a Jewish tradition, left off Ishmael as the first son. Now, why would Ishmael be left off? Does anyone know? Well, Ishmael was the son of Sarah's maid. And Sarah thought that she couldn't have children. So she told Abraham to have a child with her maid, Hagar. And Ishmael was born. Ishmael was the first son of Abraham, and therefore the chosen one. But Sarah got pregnant somehow in her old age. I mean, she was so old that she laughed when she got pregnant, and she got pregnant with Isaac. And Sarah banished Ishmael and his mother from the kingdom, which began the Muslim religion and the Muslim traditions. You can see the whole full chart of the genealogy of Jesus. It's kind of confusing to me. After Abraham, it gets kind of confusing when we get to David all the way up to Jesus. But nonetheless, it's a very nice chart. So I now want to talk about pastoral poetry. Pastoral poetry uses the idea of sheep and shepherding as a symbol to represent different aspects of life. The pastoral poem presents an idealistic, almost utopian view of rural life. In these poems, shepherds and shepherdesses are innocent, pure, and free from corruption of the city, or even the court. Some common topics of these poems were death, love, mockery of politics, and the ideal life of the country. Shepherds and shepherdesses would sing love songs to each other. Sometimes pastoral poetry is elegiac, mourning the deceased shepherd. So let's take a look at an instance of pastoral poetry in the Bible. I know we all know the 23rd Psalms, but there are some things that are different in the 23rd Psalms in the King James Version versus the Jewish Publication Society version. So the first version that you see on the left is the King James Version of the 23rd Psalms. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures, and leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So this is the traditional version that most of us would have been familiar with growing up. Now let me read you the Jewish Publication Standard Version. Now remember that Hebrew has no tenses, so listen to the difference in this passage. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Okay, so there's a few things I want you to notice. I want you to notice the parallelism in this poem, in both versions. I walk, I will fear, versus you are with, you prepare, you anoint. So there's a parallelism that goes along with the first verse. But then you go through the valley of the shadow of death. And then everything changes. Notice the shift in the pronouns. I walk through the darkest valley. I will fear no evil. You are with me. Your rod and your staff comfort me. Comfort me. You prepare a table before me. You anoint my head with oil. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So you see how those pronouns shift in the poetry? And notice the repetition. He makes, he leads, he refreshes, he guides. I walk, I will dwell. You prepare, you anoint. You see how they use this repetition and this parallelism to format the poem. There are boundaries to poetry, whereas prose really has no boundaries. Poetry must stick to some sort of form. So let's go on and let's talk about the pastoral. So William Wordsworth has a famous poem called Michael, and I've just picked out a couple of passages from this poem that talk about a covenant and what it is to make a covenant and what it is to make a promise. So let's go ahead and read these. Near the tumultuous brook of Greenhead Gill, in that deep valley, Michael had designed to build a sheepfold, and before he heard the tidings of his melancholy loss, for this same purpose he had gathered up a heap of stones, which close to the brook side lay thrown together, ready for work. With Luke that evening thitherward he walked, and soon as they had reached the place, he stopped, and thus the old man spake to him, My son, tomorrow thou wilt leave me. With full heart I look upon thee, for thou art the same. Thou wert a promise to me ere thy birth, and all thy life has been my daily joy. I will relate to thee some little part of our two histories. 'Twill do thee good, when thou art from me, even if I should speak of the things thou cost not know of. So Michael takes his son Luke out to the sheepfold, and he wants him to lay the first stone in the sheepfold so that Michael can work while he's gone and anticipate his coming back. This is a covenant, and by laying that first stone, Luke is making a covenant with his father, Michael, to come home, to return home to the farm. Because as we all know, when young men leave the farm, they often don't return. So let's look at another piece of the poem. Lay now the cornerstone, as I requested, and hereafter, Luke, when thou art gone away, should evil men be thy companions, let this sheepfold be thy anchor and thy shield. Amid all fear and all temptation, let it be to thee an emblem of thy life thy fathers lived, who, being innocent, did for that cause bestir them in good deeds. Now fare thee well, when thou returnest, thou in this place will set a work which is not here, a covenant 'twill be between us, But whatever fate befall thee, I shall love thee to the last, and bear thy memory with me to the grave. The shepherd ended here, and Luke stooped down, and as his father had requested, laid the first stone of the sheepfold. At the sight of the old man's grief broke from him. To his heart he pressed his son. He kissed him and wept, and to the house together they returned. So by laying this foundational stone, he sealed a covenant between his father and him that would last forever. Now, whether Luke makes it home before his father dies or he doesn't, Michael is going to take this covenant, this symbolic act, with him to the grave because they have made a pact. And this is how pastoral poetry works. It involves a covenant. It involves a promise. Just as the shepherd promises to watch over the sheep, pastoral poetry involves a promise or a covenant. So let's look at Jewish covenants and the burden of promise of the Jewish high holidays. So Rosh Hashanah is a holiday of celebration and introspection for many in the American Jewish community. This includes synagogue attendance, where special prayers are said. The celebration also includes festive meals with symbolic foods. Some participate in a ceremony called Tashish, whereby misdeeds of the past year, symbolized by breadcrumbs, are symbolically thrown into a flowing body of water. It is also customary to exchange New Year's cards upon Rosh Hashanah. Yom Kippur is the most solemn and introspective day of the Jewish calendar. It emphasizes personal responsibility for one's actions. Jewish tradition teaches that to atone for deeds committed against another person, you must approach that person directly and apologize. The 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is the traditional time to ask forgiveness from one's friends and neighbors, so that on Yom Kippur one can attain forgiveness and purification for all misdeeds. The act of atonement makes the claim as human beings, we are able to change and improve ourselves. On Yom Kippur, we strive to improve our relationships both with other human beings and with God. So we take on a covenant between our friends to do right by our friends, to do right by our fellow human beings. And those who we've wronged throughout the year, in the Jewish tradition, we atone for making mistakes. And this is the burden of promise, the burden of the promise that you make to God to be good to your fellow man. And when you are not, or when you do not live up to that promise, you must atone for it in the Jewish traditions. So a lot of this covenant revolves around the Jewish traditions and the Old Testament. I want to look at another instance of a covenant in the Bible. And this is the covenant between God and Abraham. This is a horrible, sad story and one of the saddest in the Bible. But this is a translation from the Jewish Publication Society. And it came to pass after these things that God did prove Abraham, and said unto him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son, whom thou lovest, even Isaac, and get thee to the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. And Abraham rose early in the morning, and saddled his ass, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son. And he cleaved the wood for a burnt offering, and rose up, and went unto the place of which God had told him. And on the 3rd day Abraham lifted up his eyes, and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said unto his young man, Abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder, and we will worship, and come back to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, and he laid it upon Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife, and they went both of them together. And Isaac spoke unto Abraham his father, and said, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, God will provide himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together. And they came to a place which God had told him of. And Abraham built the altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand, and took the knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven, and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thy hand upon thy lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou art a God-fearing man, seeing that thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, and behind him a ram, caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram, and he offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place Adonijah. And it is said to this day, in the mount where the Lord is seen. And the angel of the Lord called unto Abraham a second time out of heaven, and said, By myself have I sworn, saith the Lord, because thou hast done this thing, and hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as thy stars of heaven, and as the sand which is upon the seashore. And thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast hearkened to my voice. So Abraham returned unto his young men, and they rose up and went together into Beersheba, and Abraham dwelt at Beersheba. There are two very short verses in this stanza of the Bible. Verse 4, On the third day Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. This is when he makes the decision to go ahead with God's covenant and accept God's covenant to kill his only son. When he sees that mountain and he makes the plan, that is the covenant. That is the promise being made. And then the other short verse is verse 10. And Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. And this is how this symbolism plays into American musical poetry or American folk music of the 1960s. So let's take a look at the lyrics for Bob Dylan's Highway 61 Revisited. And God said to Abraham, Kill me a son. Abe said, Man, you must be putting me on. God said, No. Abe said, What? God say, You can do what you want, Abe, but the next time you see me coming, you better run. Well, Abe said, Where'd you want this killing done? God said, Out on Highway 61. Well, Georgia Sam, he had a bloody nose. Welfare department, they wouldn't give him no clothes. He asked poor Howard, Where can I go? Howard said, There's only one place I know. Sam said, Tell me quick, man, I gotta run. Oh, Howard just pointed with his gun and said, That way, down Highway 61. Well, Mac the Finger said to Louis the King, I got 40 red and white and blue shoestrings. and 1,000 telephones that don't ring. Do you know where I can get rid of these things? And Louis the King said, let me think for a minute, son. Then he said, yes, I think it can be easily done. Just take everything down to Highway 61. Now the fifth daughter of the 12th night told the first father, and the things weren't right. My complexion, she says, is much too white. He said, come here and step into the light. He said, you're right. Let me tell the second mother this has to be done. But the second mother was with the seventh son, and they were both out on Highway 61. Now the roving gambler, he was very bored, trying to create a next world war. He found a promoter who nearly fell off the floor. He said, I never engaged in this kind of thing before. But yes, I think it can be very easily done. We'll just put some bleachers out in the sun and have it on Highway 61. Now, while you might think that Bob Dylan is not an American poet, the way that he lays out and the symbolism that he uses, the structure that he has for his poem, the repetition, the parallelism, the way that he touches on the welfare system, the political system, the racial and sexual corruption, and the world war that's going on in Vietnam, these are all very timely ideas that he is using symbolically by associating them with Abraham and Isaac and this idea of the sacrificing a son. Now we see another song by Joan Baez called Isaac and Abraham from around the same time period. Hard times in Canaan land, trouble in the mind of man. A voice came whispering softly to him, go offer up the lamb. Abraham took his only son high up on a hill. His test of faith had finally come as the wind began to chill cold steel in the Father's hand, tears falling from the sky. The angels did not understand why the righteous should die. Abraham most mysteriously laid down that deadly knife and said, my darling son, I wish I was the one who spared your precious life. O Isaac, the light of all your days will shine upon this mountain high and never, never fade away, and never fade away. Again, we see the symbolism of Isaac and Abraham and this idea of cold steel. What is cold and steel besides a blade? Maybe a gun? What do we think of when we think of the sun and the sacrifice of the son? What's the first thing that comes to mind? Let's look at another song called The Story of Isaac by Leonard Cohen. The door, it opened slowly. My father, he came in. I was 9 years old, and he stood so tall above me. His blue eyes, they were shining, and his voice was very cold. He said, I've had a vision, and you know I'm strong and holy. I must do what I've been told. So he started up the mountain. I was running, he was walking, and his axe was made of gold. Well, the trees, they got much smaller. The lake, a lady's mirror. We stopped to drink some wine. Then he threw the bottle over. Broke a minute later, and he put his hand on mine. Thought I saw an eagle, but it might have been a vulture. I never could decide. Then my father built an altar. He looked once behind his shoulder. He knew I would not hide. You would build these altars now to sacrifice these children. You must not do it any more. A scheme is not a vision, and you never have been tempted by demon or a god. You who stand above them now, your hatchets blunt and bloody, you were not there before when I lay upon a mountain, and my father's hand was trembling with the beauty of the word. And if you call me brother now, forgive me if I inquire, just according to whose pain, when it all comes down to dust. I will kill you if I must. I will help you if I can. When it all comes down to dust, I will help you if I must. I will kill you if I can. And mercy on our uniform, man of peace or man of war. The peacock spreads his fan. I think we can see where this is going and what we're pushing towards with the symbolism. If you can't, let's look at one more song. It's called The Greatest Story Ever Told by the Grateful Dead. Moses come riding up on a quasar. His spurs were jingling, the door was ajar, his buckle was silver, his manner was bold, and I asked him to come in out of the cold. His brain was bowling, his reason was spent. His motto is nothing is borrowed, nothing is lent. He asked me for mercy, I gave him a gun. He said these things just gotta be done. Abraham and Isaac sitting on a fence. You'd get right to work if you had any sense. You know the one thing we need is a left-handed monkey wrench. Gideon come up with his eyes on the floor, said you ain't got a hinge. You can't close the door. Moses stood up above his 6'10", said you can't close the door when the walls caved in. Asking for water, he poured some wine. We finished the bottle and broke into mine. You get what you come for, you're ready to go. Well, it's 1 in 10,000 that come for the show. Abraham and Isaac digging on a well. Mama came quick with the water witch spell. Well, cool, clear water, well, you can't ever tell. Abraham and Isaac sitting on the fence. You get right to work if you had any sense. You know the one thing we need is a left-handed monkey wrench. Now, this left-handed monkey wrench reference is a kind of a hazing thing, especially in technical fields, like a plumber. You send someone who is the newbie on a search for a left-handed monkey wrench. There is no such thing as a left-handed monkey wrench. But you see that these biblical images are all pointing towards one thing. They're all pointing towards this one event that's going on. And hopefully you guys have figured it out by now. Why is the story of Abraham and Isaac so popular in the 1960s? Well, because everything they were seeing was this sacrifice of the son, America's son. America's son was being sacrificed in a foreign land for a foreign cause that we didn't understand. And those who were rich, they were the fortunate sons. They didn't have to pay. They didn't have to pay the price of war. They got out of it. But war was horrible, and Vietnam was bad, and the soldiers endured a lot. And even coming home, these folk singers became poets. They became the poets of the new generation. Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen, Joan Baez, the Dead. All of these people became poets. I think you can see it even in later generations. We can see the poetry of Common, the poetry of Kanye, the poetry of people like, or bands like Nirvana, the Foo Fighters even. Let's see, there's almost every band has some sort of message that they're trying to spread. But there is a poetic vibe to everything because it's a song. And songs are one of the forms of poetry. We're going to learn more about that later. But I hope that this lecture has kind of given you a broad overview of how poetry, covenants, and promises all work together, and how the symbolism from the Bible has been morphed into something more and something horribly meaningful to our own American society. We have taken this image of Abraham and Isaac and the sacrifice that Abraham is willing to make for God to follow God, to be devout, is the same sacrifice that we put on the mothers of this country when we send their sons off to war, right? Um, they are willing to pay the ultimate price for the idea of patriotism, the idea of freedom, and the idea of democracy. And we need to realize and remember that this is a great sacrifice that these people have made. And that not even with that people were making this sacrifice on the home front protesting this war as well. Uh, we got to remember that 4 people were killed at Kent State protesting. People that were being sent, their friends, their brothers, their siblings, that were out there dying in the war. And they had no control over it. A war that was a rich man's war for the most part. We don't really know exactly what we were over there doing, and there was no way to win. No way to win. So Vietnam was a big source of inspiration for poetry. I think throughout the ages, periods of disdain and periods of hardship become the inspiration for great works, great poetry, great music, great art. We see it throughout history. The Dark Ages inspired the Renaissance, right? The Dark Ages inspired the Renaissance. Um, After that, we have the Industrial Revolution was spurred on by periods of political disdain. So out of this disdain comes great works, great poetry. Thank you all for being patient with this lecture. I know it's been a long time coming. Hopefully everything is worked out and our formatting will be smooth from here on out. Thanks for listening.